Hello and welcome to this special broadcast on WION. My name is Mohammed Saleh. Now, the Iran war, jointly started by the United States and Israel, is reshaping geopolitics in ways that is forcing the American president to look for options. It is a war that America started, that America is now finding really hard to finish on its terms. But the question is this war being fought by America to serve its interests, or is this war being fought to serve the interests of Israel? Now, besides the Middle East, the Ukraine war too is showing no signs of coming to an end. The question is also this: does Donald Trump have a strategy for Ukraine? Because just weeks after declaring that the United States will draw down its military presence in Europe, the Trump administration has just announced that it is sending 5,000 troops to Poland. Is mixed messaging a strategy of Donald Trump, or is he a victim of his own mixed messaging? To discuss this and more, we're joined on the broadcast by Mr. Ian Bremmer. He's the president and founder of the Eurasia Group and also of the GZERO media. Mr. Bremmer, thank you very much indeed, sir, for joining us here on WION.
Sure.
Now, let me start off by asking you this. The fact that this Iran war has dragged on for a lot longer than the Trump administration expected that it would go on, do you think the way the chips have fallen down, Trump at this moment has the options to end this war on his terms?
No, but he can change his terms so he can end the war. I mean, his terms, I'm sure you know, have changed frequently every day, sometimes more often than once a day. At the beginning of the war, he said he was going to rescue the Iranian people. He doesn't talk about that anymore. He talked about needing to end their ballistic missile capability. Now he says that's something the region has to do for itself. Wanted to end their support for proxies. That's not a part of the negotiation. They've been all over the map in terms of what they're negotiating on the nuclear front. The only thing that's consistent is that under no circumstances can Iran have nuclear weapons. And of course, they need to open the strait, which had been opened until the United States and Israel launched the war. So Trump is failing at almost all of his war goals, and even the destruction of the Iranian military capabilities, which has been accomplished to a degree. But we've seen from many leaks from the U.S. intelligence departments and from the Pentagon that much of that capacity remains intact today. So Trump can declare victory. He can certainly end the war. He can end the blockade, but it won't be on any of the terms that he had intended to fight this war to accomplish.
You know, I'll talk about the Iranian nuclear enrichment in just a bit, but I want you to focus on the Strait of Hormuz. It was open before the Americans and the Israelis started this war, but now the Iranians say that they want to control the Strait of Hormuz and the traffic that passes through it. This goes clearly against the American idea of freedom of navigation, which is part of Pax Americana. In your assessment, by starting this war, has Donald Trump and also Benjamin Netanyahu given and shown Iran the possibility that they can actually control the Strait of Hormuz and dictate who has access to it?
Well, first, it's not just Pax Americana that believes in freedom of navigation. Chinese support that. The Indians support that. Pretty much every country in the world.
But the Americans are the ones who enforce it.
The Americans are the ones who have led enforcement. They are not the only country that has enforced it, as you know. But certainly you have a problem in now being able to ensure that this continues. And the Iranians have for a very long time had the ability, in principle, they have the geography. United States and Israel, they assassinated the supreme leader and some 150 other senior leaders of the Iranian regime, at which point, what did they do? They broke the glass, they pulled the lever. Right. So, I mean, there was no longer any deterrent effect, and they're in a crisis. They declare emergency. And now it turns out that indeed they have a lot of leverage. This, small and relatively weak country, nonetheless, can use its drones, can use its missiles, can use its small boat navy to cause, and its mines, to cause inordinate damage to countries of the Gulf, as well as to the global economy, including, of course, directly to India, as you've been experiencing and suffering under for months
Right.
now. And so, yes, I think that it is quite possible, despite all of the killing of their leaders, despite the thousands of Iranian civilians dead, despite all of the military hits to their infrastructure, it is quite possible that Iran will end this war, will end up in a stronger geopolitical position than they had entered it before the war started. And this is one of the reasons why Trump has been so reluctant to declare victory and end the fighting, is because he understands that right now the outcome would be worse than if he had not unilaterally withdrawn from the Iranian nuclear deal back in his first administration. And even for Trump, who can sell or try to sell for his supporters almost anything, black is white, day is night, he is having a hard time credibly being able to sell this outcome as a success.
I think that's a crucial point that you make, that at this moment, Iran appears to be much stronger than what it was before the Americans and the Israelis started this war. Now, is this a scenario where the Americans can claim that they are getting tactical victories, but they are ending up with a strategic defeat? The United States of America, that has its military bases spread across the GCC nations, is no longer going to be looked upon as a guarantor of security. It's not just a strategic loss, but it's also a loss of face for America's military in the Middle East. Is that how you see this?
The military capabilities remain world-class, and there's no other country that comes close to competing with it or could muster that kind of strength around the world. Certainly not Russia after their last 4 years, certainly not China without the experience with all the purges in their military leadership. The loss of face for the U.S. is not military, it's political.
Right.
It's the lack of legitimacy of U.S. decision-making, the lack of credibility.
Mr. Bremmer, if I can just interrupt you there.
Consistent ally.
You know, if I can just interrupt you there, no one questions the ability of the American military. But the fact that the American military was stationed in these bases in the GCC nations was to provide security for these nations. But these GCC nations have come under attack precisely because they are hosting these American military bases. So they do not serve as a guarantor of security. Do you think the GCC nations will now be looking at these American military bases and will reassess their requirement on their soil?
Well, I think that there is a very big gap inside the Gulf in how people are thinking about this. I think that the UAE is going to rely more strongly on the United States and on Israel going forward. That is a big decision that is being made. They're not happy with Iran being left in this capacity. They would want the war to continue, and they've said that privately to the Americans. And if it doesn't continue, they would join in continuing to strike Iran with the Israelis, with the U.S., as targets of opportunity emerged. The Saudis, very different. And here I see an emerging alliance, certainly an alignment with Pakistan, with Egypt, with Turkey, an Islamic alliance that will rely less on the United States, hedge away from them, and will start relying more with China, which provides the missile systems that the Saudis have, since they couldn't buy American Tomahawks. They'll be selling much of their oil to China, of course. I suspect they will be AI chip technology aligned with the Chinese at scale, cheaper than the Americans going forward. So I think there's going to be a big divide. Now, before you take away the conclusion that this is all a disaster for the United States, I want to remind you that perhaps the single most important strategic outcome of this war so far is the end of OPEC. That the UAE has withdrawn from OPEC, and they will start producing as much oil as possible beyond their previous quotas. They don't want stranded assets, and they want to move away from that. And, of course, the Americans are the world's largest producer today. Now, the existence of OPEC is bad for the United States. Breaking it apart is good for the U.S. Why? Because it is a commodity monopoly. It's a cartel. And it leads to reduced competition and higher prices. The Americans don't want that. This is also going to move the world faster beyond hydrocarbons,
Right.
away from oil and gas, and towards faster solar and nuclear and wind and electric vehicles, which we're all seeing pick up in global demand right now, and batteries and the rest. Now, this is a big advantage for China, but more importantly, it's a big advantage for the world. I mean,
Right.
you want the world to move towards sustainable, renewable energy, and it's going to happen a lot faster because of the Iran war. Now, that wasn't the American plan, and a lot of damage has been done to the global economy, not to mention the Iranian people, because of the U.S. and Israeli war. But the unintended second-order consequences are actually quite positive globally long-term.
All right, very interesting. There can be positives that can be taken away from this war as well. But I also want you to weigh in on, the elephant in the room, because it was Benjamin Netanyahu and the Mossad chief David Barnea, according to a report in the New York Times, who actually convinced the American president, Donald Trump, to start this war on Iran. Now, Donald Trump has given out a lot of mixed messaging on how he wants to proceed further. But the Israeli side seems to be pretty consistent in what they want with this war. They want this war to continue. Do you think Donald Trump can actually weigh in on Benjamin Netanyahu, considering that Israel at this moment has an active operation in Lebanon and also in the Gaza Strip? That if Trump wants a ceasefire, do you think it is in his capacity to end this war without the express consent of the Israelis?
So, I mean, you call it the elephant in the room, and I know that you in India know elephants a lot better than I do, but this must be a very small elephant you're talking about, because, Israel is not an enormously powerful country compared to the U.S., nor military, nor economy. They rely on the Americans for a significant amount of ongoing military aid. And yes,
Mr. Bremmer, the reason
right
why I refer to Israel as the elephant in the room is because
Yes.
the decision by the American president was weighed in on by the Israeli prime minister and his intelligence chief, David Barnea.
Sure, they had influence. I agree. They were pushing for it, but as was the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who was advising Trump. The people that opposed it, knowing that Trump wanted to do it, weren't giving him full information, so he wasn't getting the internal pushback. But the elephant in the room is Trump, I assure you. So, I mean, again, very small elephant, BB, but very big elephant, Trump. I mean, this is his decision. And the reason he took this decision was not because BB told him to do it. The reason he took it is because he had just come off of an incredibly successful operation in Venezuela. He felt very confident using the U.S. military. And he also had successes against the Iranians, who were talking big about hitting him back, and then did nothing. And we saw that when Trump ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani at the end of Trump's first term.
Right.
And then we saw it when Trump decided to enter late the 12-day war last June. So again, I accept your characterization that for a very long time, for many U.S. administrations, the Israeli prime minister has been pushing for the U.S. to enter this war against Iran, and finally had a president that was willing to go along with him, with Trump. But the decision was not Bibi's. The decision was Trump. He had many reasons for doing so, albeit they were faulty reasons, and they've led to a very big mistake.
Right. Now, the Iranians have made it clear that any peace deal will also require peace in Lebanon and also in the Gaza Strip. That means Donald Trump will have to rein in Netanyahu. Do you think it is in his capacity to rein in Netanyahu?
It depends on how much he's willing to do. I mean, if he was willing to actually lead to consequences. I mean, when I saw Trump go to the Knesset in Israel after announcing the phase 1 of the Gaza peace deal that Trump constructed, with a approved resolution at the Security Council, no vetoes, and all the Arab states on board, Trump had standing ovations from the entire Israeli political spectrum. And the Israeli prime minister, very unpopular, was roundly booed. So, I mean, Trump is the most popular politician in Israel. He was joking the other day that after he leaves the U.S. presidency, he should go and run for prime minister in Israel. which is a kind of amusing joke, frankly. He can be quite funny.
Right.
And so, yeah, I believe that if he wanted to use leverage against Israel,
Right.
he certainly has the ability to do that. He's used leverage against Ukraine. He's used it against the Europeans. He's used it against Mexico and Canada. Why not use it against Israel? He hasn't wanted to. And the reason for that is because he, his kids, his donors, a lot of them are very, very strongly pro-Israel and pro-Zionist. And so I do think that his preference is not to do that. It's not about his ability.
All right. Now, let's talk a bit about Iran's nuclear program. In 2018, Donald Trump, when he was president in his first term, tore up the JCPOA, saying that it was the worst negotiated deal in American history. The JCPOA, which stands for Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was signed during the Obama time in 2015. In your assessment at this moment, do you think it has dawned on Donald Trump that probably walking out of the JCPOA was actually a bad decision on his part?
He very rarely looks back on decisions that he makes as bad decisions. If a bad decision has been made, it must be somebody else's fault, because he's faultless, and that narcissism has served him well in campaigns and in selling stuff. It hasn't served him as well in making policy decisions. So no, I don't think he believes it was a mistake. But remember, the reason why it was such a bad deal wasn't because of the content of the deal. It was because it wasn't Trump. It was Obama. If the same deal had been cut by Trump, he would have said it was the best deal ever signed by the United States. So, I mean, you know, we all know this, right? I mean, it's embarrassing, and it shows a level of unfitness of President Trump for the position. But it is the way he describes these things, and we shouldn't give it the seriousness with which the media frequently characterizes it.
Well, it is the president who's doing the talking. But in your assessment, now Donald Trump needs to strike a deal with Iran. Can he come up with a deal that was better than the JCPOA that was struck during the Obama's time? Or do you think, given what has transpired in this war so far, America's hand is weaker on forcing the Iranians to give up their nuclear enrichment?
I'll be impressed if he's able to come up with a deal that is the equivalent or better than the JCPOA. And even if he does, it will come against a backdrop where the Iranians are getting paid off to allow transit through the strait in some way, with some mechanism, and with the Iranian people going through considerably greater hardship than if the war hadn't occurred, with a very brutal regime still in place. So there is the deal itself, and I think it's quite plausible, as you suggest, that any deal that is signed, and there may be no deal at all, will end up being weaker than the JCPOA. But even if it is stronger, you're going to have other components of relations with Iran which will be more problematic. I was supportive of the JCPOA when it was signed, but I did not think it was a big deal. I thought it was oversold by John Kerry, Secretary of State at the time, and by President Obama. It didn't involve the ballistic missiles, where there were Security Council resolutions and the Iranians were in breach. It didn't do anything to involve their support for proxies and terrorist organizations around the region and more broadly. It only addressed for a short period of time, the nuclear enrichment capabilities that the Iranians had. And they were in compliance with most of that for the period of time that it was in effect.
Right.
But still, the inspections were a challenging process. So it was a moderate success if you recognize it was a deal of relatively limited consequence that was oversold by Obama.
All right, so there is this raging war in West Asia. There's also this raging war in Eastern Europe. And in the last few minutes, there's this announcement that has come where just weeks after Donald Trump had said that he wants to draw down troops in Europe, the Trump administration has just announced that they want to send 5,000 troops to Poland. This is being said as some kind of a redirection of the troops that existed in some parts of Europe and being sent towards Poland. How do you think the Russians would look at the fact that the Americans are increasing their troop presence so close to their border in Poland?
Well, first, let me fully frame this for you. These were 5,000 troops that were planned to be sent to Poland. Then last week, the Trump administration said that they weren't going to send them.
Right.
So it looked like a drawdown from the previous agreement. The Polish government was incensed, especially because they have been stepping up their own military expenditure beyond that of any major country in Europe, moving to 5% of GDP, which is much more than the Americans spend for GDP on defense globally. And then Trump essentially undid his previous decision. So this is less about the way it looks to the Russians than it is about the Europeans maintaining some level of status quo on Poland-US relations as the Americans are drawing down some of their exposure with Germany because Trump was angered by what he thought was an insult from the German chancellor saying that the US was being humiliated by Iran.
Right. But that is true. But how do you think the Russians would be looking at the fact that the Americans want their troop presence so close to their border? The fact that Donald Trump has been on a sort of a seesaw in terms of the announcement that he's been making, and this is what the American administration is now saying, that 5,000 troops will be in Poland, contrary to what they just said a few weeks back.
Yes, well, again, there are already troops in Poland. This is not new. I don't think it really changes the relationship between the United States and Russia. What is new is that the U.S. is fighting against the Europeans and the U.S. is squeezing the Ukrainians, and they're removing a lot of military capabilities and repurposing them for the Middle East. And those divisions are useful for Putin. But the big change in the war is about Ukraine's own capabilities. It's about their drones. It's about their AI. And the big change that the Russians have gotten from America is not about troops in Poland. It's about Elon Musk that shut down Russia's access to Starlink.
Right.
And Elon was not ordered by the U.S. government to do that. He did it himself. But that means that suddenly Elon is a great secret weapon for the Ukrainians, and the Russians are a year behind on drones because, you know, Starlink, I'm sure you've seen them. It's the size of a dinner plate. You can stick them on a drone. You can stick them on an unmanned vehicle that drives into a trench and blows up soldiers.
Right.
The Russian equivalent technology today is the size of a dinner table. You can't use it on the drones. It's too big and unwieldy. So suddenly the Ukrainians have this incredibly unmanned capability, and the Russians can't compete with it. And that has led to the first month in 3 years where the Ukrainians are net retaking territory in the war on the front lines. The Russians are not.
I think it's interesting that you highlight the way the dynamic in the Ukraine war in the last 3-4 weeks appears to have changed. Now, when Joe Biden was the president, the Americans were all in assisting Ukraine. That assistance came down as soon as Donald Trump took charge. But the fact that the Ukrainians are now, it appears, winning on the battlefield, do you think that could bring the Trump administration to again back Ukraine against Russia in a big way?
I'm not sure. I mean, again, Trump is capable of changing his mind frequently. And when he threw President Zelensky out of the White House last April and said he didn't have the cards and then suspended intelligence cooperation, that was a pretty big slap in the face. I think that if the Americans decide they're going to work more closely with Ukraine, the Ukrainians will not act as supplicants the way they have before. They'll act with more confidence. So that's an interesting point. I do know that when the Iranian war started and Zelensky traveled to the Gulf and offered support to America's Gulf allies in helping them defend against Iranian drones, that privately President Trump was incensed that Zelensky did that. And we have to remember why it is that Trump hates Zelensky. It's not because he's a fan of Putin. It's because Zelensky refused to open a private investigation into President Biden and Hunter Biden when Trump demanded that he do so, and Trump was impeached as a consequence of that call. So Trump's personal enmity for President Zelensky is something I suspect that he holds extremely strongly and that will not be changed by a shift in the war between the Russians and the Ukrainians.
Right now, Mr. Bremmer, for people who are watching Donald Trump, the American president, closely, what a lot of people are baffled with is how he's been dealing with long-term American allies, especially in the context of Europe, where he has accused the NATO allies of essentially ripping America's economy off by relying on America's security umbrella. Is there a reason or any kind of a logic as to why Donald Trump, in effect, is alienating some of America's closest allies in this manner?
Well, part is because he doesn't care about the allies. America First is not an election slogan that is meant to appeal to the Europeans or to India or to Japan. It was meant to promote Donald Trump at home with the people that were voting for him. And last I checked, only Americans vote in American elections.
Right.
Also, over the last 30 years, the principal changes in the geopolitical dynamic globally have been China rising and America's allies declining. So when you look at Europe or Canada, Japan, South Korea, what you see mostly are countries that aren't spending on defense. They're not spending on technology R&D. They're laggards in artificial intelligence. They're laggards in productivity and growth. And most of them are demographically shrinking.
Right.
So the United States was spending an awful lot of money and getting less return from these allies that were weaker. Now, I think that's an objective reality. Now, the way that Trump handled that, which was to treat his allies with contempt and to mistreat them and to act unilaterally, I think was very short-term in orientation and ultimately will damage America's position in the world.
Right.
But President Trump doesn't really care much about the long term. He's 80 years old. He's thinking about today and tomorrow. He was almost assassinated once, 3 assassination attempts. So he's not thinking about 10, 20 years down the road. He's thinking about right now. And also,
no, but let's think about 10, 20 years down the road.
He frequently elevates himself above the interests of the country.
Right.
And so you need to look at his monetization from a country like Pakistan or from the Gulf states and the business that he and his family is doing. You frequently need to understand that before you understand the broader national interest of the country. I'm not happy saying that, either domestically or internationally, but I'd be lying to you if it wasn't the case.
All right, now, but looking ahead 10, 20 years from now, do you think the Americans value their relationship in Europe like they did in the second part of the 20th century, or has the relevance of Europe to the United States of America actually lessened, which is effectively what's been said by Donald Trump?
Sure, it's lessened, but I think that, and some permanent damage has been done, but I think that the scope of that damage can be limited in a post-Trump environment, and probably will.
All right, interesting. Let's also talk a little bit about domestic politics within the United States of America. Donald Trump will be fighting the midterms in about 6 months from now. The Iran war has resulted in some amount of inflation. How much do you think the American population is suffering because of Trump taking the United States of America into a war that most American people don't want?
It's probably suffering at this point less than you'd think, in the sense that the stock market's doing very well, and a lot of Americans do have investments in the stock market through their pensions, their retirement plan. Also because the U.S. is a net energy exporter, and so overall the growth levels in the U.S. are still relatively robust. So this isn't hurting the U.S. the way it is the Europeans, for example, or Japan, for example. But still, when you talk about working and middle-class Americans, these are not shareholders. These are people that still need to fill their car up with gas. They still go and they buy groceries. And the reality is that inflation is a lot higher today because of the war than it would have been if the U.S. hadn't decided to attack Iran, which led to the closing of the strait. And Trump has no ability to deflect that.
Right.
And that's going to keep going for a long time. It's not just about, we already talked, even if you ended the war, you're still going to have months before you get all the ships to get back to where they were supposed to go.
Right.
You got to rebuild and repair all the energy infrastructure that was damaged in the Gulf. But then you have the food issue, and you've lost fertilizer for an entire growing season. That's going to last an entire year. And that's already done. Doesn't matter what happens with the war. So all of that is going to affect the United States, and it's making Trump historically unpopular. He's slightly below 40% approval ratings right now. He's massively underwater on inflation and the economy. And that's not going to change, in my view, before November, which is the midterm elections.
Right.
So even though there has been a strong effort by the Republicans to redistrict so they have advantages in individual races, and the Supreme Court just voted in favor of the Republican position on the Voter Rights Act, which will further assist some redistricting. That will not be enough to keep the House.
All right.
It may not be enough to keep the Senate. So in November, I would make a very strong bet that Trump is going to look like a loser, and the Iran war will be a big reason for that.
I think that's an interesting statement that you're making. We'll have to wait and watch as to how it plays out. But also, weighing a bit about the MAGA movement itself, Make America Great Again, where the people in America said that it is important for the American president to focus on the issues of the American people, like, for instance, the housing crisis, like, for instance, the student debt, inflation, manufacturing jobs coming back. Do you think Donald Trump getting involved in these foreign wars, which he said is something that he would never do, has in many ways betrayed the MAGA movement? Is that how his support base sees this?
Some of them do. Most of them don't. His support is a grievance-based support of people that think that the system has been weaponized by establishment political figures for a long time. And so there's a great depth of anger, and they support him for having lived through the assassination attempts and the efforts to imprison him and jail him, convict him, all of these things. So impeach him. And so don't underestimate the strength of the MAGA movement, but you can't win with just the MAGA movement. You need independence. And he's losing those people. And he's losing some of MAGA because some of what he stood for, he's not following through. Now, there are some areas where he's consistent. He said he was going to secure the border, and certainly there are a lot fewer illegal immigrants coming to the United States, and he's prioritized that, and his supporters appreciate it. But he also said he would drain the swamp, and that there would no longer be a two-tier system of justice in the U.S. And yet you now see an IRS effort with $1.8 billion going to his political supporters, taxpayer money, and saying that it's no longer legal to audit the president or his family for anything they might have done, or have a lawsuit against them. And so he's putting himself above the law. And so the swamp is not being drained. That's why the Epstein decision not to release all the files, the flip on that was so unpopular with MAGA. There are many MAGA supporters that believe that this war supports Israel, but doesn't support the United States, and they oppose an Israel-first policy that's divided some of MAGA. Still, most MAGA support him on the war, about 70%, but losing 30% is significant. He usually has 90% support on most issues with MAGA, if not higher. So I do think that President Trump has given up on many of the things that got him elected, and that is going to be a challenge for any successor to Trump who wants to harness these voters, but is going to have a hard time differentiating themselves from the sitting president.
I think that's going to be the challenge for Donald Trump before the midterms. Mr. Ian Bremmer, thank you very much indeed, sir, for joining us with all those insights there. Thank you very much indeed.
Good talking.